Hey guys, it's Eric here, and I'm back with another episode of the Engaging with Eric podcast. This episode entails a candid conversation about the Joe Rogan controversy. For those who do not know, popular podcaster and host of the Joe Rogan Experience podcast, Joe Rogan landed himself in trouble as a result of inaccurate comments that he made about the COVID-19 pandemic, COVID-19 vaccines, and past racist comments that he has made. In this episode, I speak with two very close friends of mine, Luke and Sean, in an open and honest way about how we feel about the controversy. We discuss our initial thoughts on the controversy, the polarized responses to it, the sincerity of Joe Rogan's apology for the past comments that he made, whether the glued focus on Rogan by the mainstream media was warranted in regards to COVID misinformation, whether the attack on Rogan had a coordinated element to it, cancel culture and the nature of public discourse today, the importance of empathy in public discourse, and lots more. It's important for me to state that Luke, Sean, and myself condemn and do not endorse the mishaps of Joe Rogan. And we did not intend for this video to be an apologist video dedicated to Rogan. However, we did not want this video to be hyperbolically critical either. We aim for nuance and authenticity, and to try and openly and honestly share our perspective on the matter as three young Irish people. That being said, I had a lot of fun speaking with two of my very close friends about the issue, and I hope you enjoy listening to it. Without further ado, here it is. Hey guys, it's Eric here, and I am back with another episode of the Engaging with Eric podcast, or should I say the Eric Ehige experience. And in this episode, I'm joined with two very good friends of mine, Luke Casserly and Sean Carey. And as you can see from the title of this episode, we're going to be discussing the Joe Rogan controversy in a frank and honest way. Before we get into it, before I kind of outlay what the chronology, the itinerary will be for the episode, do you want to share a bit about yourselves? Maybe Sean, do you want to just a brief introduction?
Yeah, I've known Eric, I think, from ISSU mainly. He was a guest on my podcast, the Dead Icons podcast. A little bit of a plug there for myself. Yeah, I don't know what else you want me to say.
No, that's perfect. And I do advise you, I'm going to have links in the bio for Sean's podcast. It's a fantastic podcast. And as we've chatted about in the past, as I've told him, it's very unique in regard to the content that he puts out there. And in regard to the content too, there's no better host, I think, for and Luke, do you want to introduce yourself also?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Luke, and I am a good friend of Eric's. Eric was in my class back in first year in secondary school, which is a long time ago. And I suppose we really became friends when we were both on the Irish Second Level Students' Union Executive. And now we host a podcast together, the Political Incorrectors podcast. We're co-hosts of that. So yes, thanks for having me, Eric. I'm looking forward to being engaged with and engaging with your podcast.
No, I see what you did there, Luke. That was nice. But I'm gonna say also that I'll have a link to the Political Incorrectors podcast in the description also. But okay, lads, we're here today to discuss the Joe Rogan controversy, and I think it kickstarted when he made some controversial comments about COVID-19 and had two doctors on his podcast who had controversial opinions about COVID-19. I think he said things like, he felt like young people didn't have to get the vaccine, young, healthy people. And this was, of course, debunked and disproved by a lot of medical professionals, health professionals. He also hosted Robert Malone and Peter McCullough, I believe, who carry controversial perspectives in regards to COVID. He said things also, Rogan, like mRNA, gene therapy. He committed to a lot of statements that are frankly, anti-factual, anti-truth, you might call them. And thereafter, there was a kind of an onslaught in the media, just a cascade of coverage on Joe Rogan, for like 3 weeks, just on COVID-19. And when you saw COVID-19 misinformation in the media, Rogan's face or his name was to it. That was guaranteed. And then all of a sudden, a bomb dropped when India Arie put out a video of Rogan saying the N-word consecutively, successively in a video. I believe it's over the span of 12 years. He said the N-word many times in the video, and people started, I think, collecting or recollecting coverage, or rather videos from the JRE Experience, Joe Rogan's podcast, in which he said racist things or said things that people deemed to be problematic and troublesome. Then we had a massive reaction on social media. But on the one hand, I think there was an extreme aspect to the anti-Joe Rogan crowd. People were saying, he's misogynistic, he's racist, he embodies toxic masculinity, he wants to promote COVID misinformation to bring harm to the community. Then you had more subtle criticism from people who said things like, he's not absolutely bad, but still what he's doing can act as a conduit to extremism. He facilitates extremism, he spreads negative views, and to a certain extent, he acts like an apologist or as an apologist for negative aspects in social discourse. Also, there was an article written in CNN about how Joe Rogan, he represents another January 6th moment, which was, Sean is shaking his head for those listening. But the January 6th, of course, moment initially was the insurrection. I shouldn't say initially as if I agree with the proposition of the article, but the insurrection of the Capitol in America, where extremists, led a sort of a protest, a rally, or it was just an ambush nearly of the parliamentary building in America. So there was a lot of extreme reactions, a subtle reaction too. Then you had people defending Joe Rogan, people saying things like this is an example of the cancel culture left, the wokesters coming out to cancel Joe and get rid of him, and more subtle support from people that maybe were a bit more nuanced and said what he did was wrong, but at the same time, I don't think he's a outright bad person. So I have to ask you lads, what were your initial thoughts when you saw all of this unfold, the Joe Rogan controversy? Anyone can come in first.
Yeah, I'll be completely honest, right? I used to watch Joe Rogan, or listen to his podcast mainly on when he was on Apple Podcasts, probably 2 years ago. So I kind of hadn't been really keeping up to date with Joe Rogan. Throughout COVID, I had seen the kind of COVID misinformation stuff about him kind of telling young people not to take the vaccine. The ivermectin stuff came out, and then obviously that particular doctor whose name I can't remember, who kind of was against mRNA vaccines, and all this built up in my mind. It was like, God, Joe Rogan's a silly bitty. He's like, it's just so irresponsible. He shouldn't be doing that. He has a massive platform. He should know better. And then I saw this big story break. People calling for his podcast to be taken off Spotify, essentially for Joe Rogan to be cancelled. And I'll be completely honest, whether it's me being conditioned to cancel culture, air quotes, or just me not researching it enough, my initial opinion was like, okay, he has to go. It's so irresponsible, he has to go. And so that was probably my first reaction. Being completely honest, that this is bad, time for Joe to go. But I do think that's me being conditioned to the kind of society culture we're in at the minute, and we can get into that a bit, I suppose, Eric, maybe as we go. But yeah, that's my initial reaction.
Yeah, perfect. And what about you, Sean?
Yeah, similar to Luke, I would have listened to him a lot. Say, I started listening to podcasts around TY in 5th year. I listened to him a lot then. And then I would have kind of gone off the boil. See, my thing with Joe is I don't like him as a person necessarily. I find him, he'd just be somebody I know personally I wouldn't get along with. But at the same time, I do like his podcast because he is one of the best interviewers I've ever seen. He'll bring somebody on. It could be anybody from Ben Shapiro to Bernie Sanders. And he'll give them 3 hours and you can talk. They can go wherever they want with the conversation in a way that you don't see being allowed to happen on radio or on television. Now, my take on what happened was initially quite similar to Luke. I never went as far to say that I thought he should be cancelled, but I was kind of watching the stuff come out about COVID and thinking to myself, now, like Luke said himself, silly bitty, come on. Like, what are you doing? What is your aim behind this? You should know better. Like, he's no genius, but he's not an idiot either. At the same time. But when he made his first apology video, he made a very good point in it that I remember hearing and kind of going, actually, do you know what? He's dead right. And what he said was that things that this time last year were considered misinformation, absolutely false, things that you would have been kicked off social media, such as the lab leak theory, such as cloth masks aren't that effective, such as when you're vaccinated, you can still pass on the virus. These things were considered no-nos, not true. You would be banned off of Twitter for saying those. And he makes a good point that what was considered completely wrong a year ago is now considered either plausible or fact. So does that pose the question then that he should be allowed to raise these questions about the vaccines, about the effects of them? Because who knows where we'll be a year from now. I want to say before, I am triply vaccinated. This is not an anti-vax stance. I want to get that out straight away. But I think it's a good point that, things change, information changes, and we have to be able to, if we're not able to question these things, then, we're not going to move anywhere. We're not going to move in any direction.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally hear you, both of you. And I think to a great extent, I was in the same boat as you. When it first came out, I think I chatted with Luke about it for a bit, and in a conversation rather, and I told Luke that, like, when I saw misinformation everywhere, I saw Joe Rogan, and I wasn't necessarily happy with the fact that he became the face of misinformation, despite the fact I understood it to a certain extent, because he has like 11 million people listen to his podcast. That's like, he trumps mainstream media in regards to followership or listenership. Mainstream media in America, Fox, CNN, they don't come near Joe Rogan. And because he has so many ears glued to his podcast, I think that comes with, as Uncle Ben says in Spider-Man, with great power comes responsibility. I think he needs to appreciate that. And a lot of people are saying, like, he's just a guy who has honest conversations and he's curious. And I think that is true to a great extent, but that is by no means a license to freely spew anything you want to. So this is I embrace that position, but at the same time, I wasn't happy that when I saw COVID misinformation, first and foremost, I saw Joe Rogan as if he was responsible for the anti-vaxxer movement. And I think this feeds into a point I definitely want to chat to you about, lads. I think the Rogan thing, it was nearly co-opted by people left and right to make a particular political point. Misinformation, to me, every anti-vaxxer I know doesn't know Joe Rogan. And every Joe Rogan fan I know is not an anti-vaxxer. And I think this says something, it points to a flaw or a gap or a loophole in the mainstream narrative, that he is kind of the bastion of COVID misinformation. Despite the fact that he needs to be held to account, there are far more deeper issues, I think societal issues, that can actually lead people to COVID misinformation, like a lack of education, socioeconomic disadvantage, fear. And I think once you load the kind of responsibility wholly on one person, it provides an easy reason to evade a lot of the issues that a lot of people face that might lead them into positions of insecurity and have them embrace anti-vaxxer messaging. So I wasn't happy that he was a singular focus. Like, I saw videos from Al Jazeera to CNN to MSNBC. I saw an RT article. I understand he's a huge platform, fair enough, but there are far deeper problems. Trust me, man. Coming from Longford, hearing people talk and their theories about where things come from, it's fair. Like, the world was flipped upside down overnight. A lot of people felt fear, and it made them susceptible to anti-vaxxer populism. You politicize that at your peril, because you're going to lose a lot of people. You scapegoat one person and act as if they're responsible for all of that at your peril, because you're going to lose a lot of people. It's a bit like when Trump was elected. This is the example I said to Luke. It's like Hillary Clinton was using these culturally in tune terms to appease the educated class, to get their hairs jumping off their back, terms that I would love to hear. Equality, diversity, for all people, inclusion, very important topics. But Trump was talking to the dispossessed, to the people who had been hurt by the NAFTA deal, people facing socioeconomic challenges. And whoops, all of a sudden Trump got elected. And when he got elected, the likes of Clinton were saying he was elected because of racism and because of a lack of gender equality. That might be true, and they may be variables. But by gosh, if you're going to ignore the NAFTA deal, and if you're going to ignore the opioid crisis, you're going to lose elections successively into the future. So I think with Rogan, something similar dynamic, I think, is what I noticed. People were evading the more deeper problems that can cause COVID misinformation and singularly focusing on Rogan. And I think both had to be done simultaneously. I wonder what your thoughts are.
Yeah, if I can pop in there. I really agree with your point, Eric. And this kind of this kind of shifted my thinking, I think, on this whole story when you pointed out the fact that, okay, yes, Joe Rogan's misinformation is problematic, but there are much bigger problems in the world. And when you look at why someone might interpret what's being said on Joe Rogan's podcast as factual, or why like they might come to an anti-vax conclusion after watching Joe Rogan's podcast, it's because they weren't given the tools when they were in school, or even currently now, by government or by the state or by educators, to be able to like be politically and socially, culturally literate enough to be able to determine what's fact and what's fiction. And I think that we need to put a focus on that, because we see that in Ireland, not just with COVID, but with politics in general. I think if you were to go on the street, or you to go onto a college campus and ask people who's the Minister for Agriculture, I'd say maybe 2% of people would know the answer. And that's just one example of people being politically illiterate. We're not given these tools. And yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that's why we have a problem. And maybe Joe Rogan isn't the problem. He has responsibility for sure, and he should be held to account. But ultimately, he shouldn't take the fall, because there's failures in giving people the right tools to be literate. In this new age, in fairness, it's a completely new age of information.
Yeah, I'd agree with what both of you said. I would disagree in the reasons. I think Joe Rogan is a symptom of something, but I think it's a symptom of a complete distrust in media. And I don't even think it's because, like, I do to a certain extent, the spread of misinformation is because people aren't able to, like you said, they're not literate. I don't even like that word, but they're not able to differentiate between what is fact and what is fiction. But I think a massive part of that is because so many people didn't grow up with social media in the way that we are now. You know, like how many people over the age of 30 had Twitter, had Instagram, had this massive access to information that touched their fingers. Like it is something that people haven't had to deal with before. But I think the symptom is the deeper problem is the fact that people don't trust media. I think media corporations have to take a hand in this as well. Like I think they have lost credibility over the last few years, and I think in certain instances with good cause. Now look, Fox News before Trump, like there seems to be kind of a turn from 2016 onwards. There was massive distrust, but Fox News before that, I don't think anybody who had two brain cells rubbed together really trusted that, if we're being honest, right? But corporations like CNN were always fairly legit, fairly upstanding, fairly well-respected media corporations. I think that, particularly in America, has changed massively. Like even here in Ireland, with like, I genuinely would liken RT's coverage of COVID at times to bordering on fear-mongering. And I don't think there's some grand conspiracy behind it. I think it is purely profit. They understood their business model. Places like CNN, RT, Fox News, Al Jazeera, all these companies, these big media corporations, that business model is dying. And what is coming up is the Joe Rogan. Like, think 10 years ago, this here, what we were doing would have been impossible. We would have had to go study media, get a job in RTE in one of these companies, and hope that eventually we get to a point where we can have a show where we can speak about these topics that we find interesting. That has completely changed now. And what is now the model is literally somebody with a microphone like Joe Rogan can just start talking. If people like him, they'll listen. And I think the reason so many people have gravitated towards Rogan is because of their distrust and their dislike for media corporations.
That's a great point. And I actually I think I agree completely with you, Sean. And of course, I agree with you too, Luke. But I think we made two separate points. I agree with you, Sean, because I do think that Rogan's rise is a symptom of distrust in the media. I actually watched a video I was consuming. I think all of us were just articles and videos about the controversy before this episode. And I saw a video from Russell Brand in which he shared a video, or rather a clip or an excerpt from a show of Rachel Maddow's, I believe her name is, on CNN. And this perfectly speaks to your point, Sean, but I think the point that Luke and I were making. Rachel Maddow said in her excerpt if you get the COVID vaccine, the virus will end with you and you can't pass it on to people. And over the past few months, my conversation with anti-vaxxer people I know and trying to convince them that the vaccine is safe, that they should take it, changed. Why? Because they were saying to me, well, the media told us first that if I took it, I couldn't pass on the virus and that it wouldn't impact me. Figures like Rachel Maddows. But now we know that that's not true. So how do you expect me to believe anything they say? So I think that distrust in the media is a valid point. It's not to say that there was a concerted, motivated effort to spread misinformation about the vaccine. I think someone like Rachel Maddows probably just wanted to encourage people to do what was best for them and do what was safe for them. But I do think distrust of the media because of blips or bloopers like this is responsible for the rise of Rogan. But not only mistakes like this, I think the nature of conversations in the media is inauthentic. Sometimes I think the kind of short period of time you have to speak is just not ideal for authentic discussions, whereas people see Rogan as being someone who has 4-hour discussions on like deep or heavy political, social, cultural, sports-related subjects. But I do think when it comes to COVID misinformation, Rogan is to be identified as a culprit because of what he said, but he's not to be the ultimate demon or seen as the penultimate villain in this regard, because if you see him that way, you can't get to the deeper issues. Like if you walk through Longford, let's be honest, like just walk right through the main street in Longford town. Like you ask, what do you think of COVID-19? Did you get the vaccine? I think the majority of people would say they did get the vaccine, it was okay. But depending on parts you walk to, like the estate I grew up, for example, you could hear a plethora of different theories about how it came about and who's trying to control what, different conspiracy theories. Because I do think there's a disproportionate kind of concentration of ideas, and ideas I think infiltrate some sectors of our society more than others, basically because of maybe disadvantage and a lack of education and a lack of, as you said, Luke, educational literacy. Like the only reason I know what a vaccine is, for example, is because I did a biology. That's how I know how it operates within the body. If I didn't do that, I'd have had to take the effort to look it up. And that's easy for any three of us. We're in university, we use the internet much, but that's a cost. And not everyone has enough energy to commit to that cost. So identifying the deeper issues, I think, is essential. Not doing that, I think, and focusing on Rogan, I think, is somewhat of a distraction if you don't do it within proportion or within reason. So this is. I wonder if any of you have any comments. I know, Sean, you disagree. Do you still disagree, or I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think I kind of left my point open there. What I'm kind of saying about it is, like, I agree with what you're saying about how a lot of the conversations you see on media corporations seem to be quite inauthentic, and you'd have these 8-minute slots that they have to fill, everyone shouting over each other for those 8 minutes, and no one actually says anything. And then, we'll cut to a break. We'll be back in a second. But I also think that, like, I kind of want to tie some up. I think I left hanging there in my last little segment where I said that I likened RT's coverage to near fear mongering. I don't think there's, like, I want to make this very clear. I don't think there's any grand plan or anything ridiculous like that. I think it is purely profit based because they understand that COVID is probably one of the best things to happen to a lot of these corporations. It genuinely is financially. I know Eric is laughing for those that can't see, but financially, it is probably the best thing. Like, I remember for the first 6 months, I'd say, of the pandemic, every night when Tony Hoolan came on the television, my family was glued to it. Now, my family, before and after, rarely watches RTE, they might watch the 9 o'clock news, but they wouldn't pay as much attention to it as they were. But the coverage that they've had, how comprehensive, how, I would say, almost invasive, total for the last 2 years. And it's because they understand that bad news sells. And you don't get any of the positive, you don't get the other side of the story in any way, I don't think, with a lot of these corporations.
I'm sorry, Eric, I might come in as well. Firstly, I just wanted to kind of clarify my point. And Sean, you did say when I was talking about kind of political literacy, it's cultural literacy. It is a bit of an uncomfortable phrase, definitely. I think that's because I think it can be used in a kind of condescending way to look down on maybe particular communities that mightn't have those skills. But my point isn't to, like, in any way be condescending towards them. It's a purely structural and policy issue for me, because they should have those skills. And the reason they don't have those skills is because of the state, and because of policymakers. So I never want to kind of demonize them. And I think a lot of that language as well, talking about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, I think that's a lot to do with it as well, that people kind of felt talked down on. But I think the problem there is that they don't have those skills. And maybe there's a reason they don't have those skills as well. You know, like maybe people have a vested interest in there being a cohort of people in society who don't have political literacy. And just before, Sean, you pop in as well, in defense of RTE, I think it's really important to make to distinguish between RTE in Ireland, which is our state broadcaster, and kind of corporate media in America. I think they're polar opposites. RTE, I really don't think there was someone said, like, let's pump up the fear factor here. I do think that COVID, it's a once in a lifetime pandemic. I mean, just think back to those scenes from Italy. And when I have these conversations with people about COVID and, you know, fear factor, I think back to the scenes in Italy of hundreds of military trucks driving to a town filled with coffins. At the start of this pandemic, it was a really, really, really scary thing. I remember the WhatsApp messages going around in Ireland saying the army are going to be on the street and enforcing curfews. And people were afraid. And I think people's response came from fear. I genuinely don't think our state broadcaster wanted to spread fear. I think they just wanted to inform people. And maybe they didn't do that perfectly. But I think they had good intentions. Corporate broadcasters, though, I do think that money is a thing there, and they're going to think about what gets views. I would disagree with the fact that RT pushed a fear lever, though.
May I just jump in there? Yeah, firstly about your the literacy. Yeah, I agree with you about the demonizing the communities. With me, the issue I have is when it begins to demonize opinions, when particular opinions are looked down upon as being, that's an opinion of somebody who doesn't have literacy skills or doesn't have that type of skills. And I think that, I want to stress this beforehand, I'm left leaning on pretty much everything, right? But I thought particularly in the those people that voted for Donald Trump and people that were pro-life in the abortion referendum, I thought the way in which they were talked about at times and their opinions, they were seen as people that were somewhat illiterate. Now, and I get you were making a different point, but that's why when I said that earlier, I was kind of like, I don't like that phrase because I think sometimes it's used to demonize certain points of view. On what you're saying about RT, I absolutely agree with you at the very start. I think it was a once in a lifetime thing. It was terrifying, and that image that you spoke of is one that every time I talk about the pandemic with my mother, that's the one that she brings up every time, and it is one that's stuck in my head as well. But with me, it was more so that as the pandemic went on, and as things were beginning to look up, I still felt like there was very much no, don't forget about it. Particularly one incident I'd point to was coming out of the very darkest days of the pandemic, which was around this time last year. Just the things where, I think if you remember, we were still in a lockdown, but there was mad numbers after Christmas into January, and then they kind of began to come back down and things were starting to ease up a little bit. And they brought out a documentary about what had happened just a month ago. And I remember thinking, like, is this really the best time to bring out that documentary? It just felt like it was kind of a, don't forget, lads, don't forget how bad things were just a couple of weeks ago. I know things are good now, but don't forget how bad things were just a minute ago. And I just felt like a continuum of kind of keep coming back, keep listening to it, keep listening, look how bad things are, look how bad things still are. Even now, as we're moving out, every time I listen to RT radio, they are still talking about COVID. And I know it hasn't gone away. I know it's not just disappeared, but things are starting to head back to normal, and we are still talking about it on the national broadcaster. Like, whatever about reporting the case numbers, absolutely. But I heard the day that they lifted the mask mandate, they brought on everybody who it seemed they could possibly find to say that getting rid of masks was a bad thing. That's my point of view on it.
No, that's fair enough. That's fair enough, Sean. And I think, firstly, to concur with aspects of what both of you have said, I think there's a categorical difference between RT and, let's say, Fox News or CNN. I think we can all agree on that unanimously. I do take your point, Sean. I've heard that point being made by a lot of people who think that the media's coverage on COVID has been excessive. In terms of how I think COVID very much was an unprecedented occurrence for the world. So I don't think, maybe I understand you kind of touched on how there's an incentive for coverage because of the fact that it might see the number of people engaging with media increasing, and that might be true. But I think first and foremost, just the nature, the magnitude of the event and what it represented, COVID-19 for us. I don't think anyone who's experienced COVID has experienced something similar, any young person anyway. So I think that brings with it a certain level of seriousness and a glued sort of approach to COVID. But okay, so we thought we touched on the media aspect and the COVID-19 comments. And I have to say too that I was never a real big listener of the Joe Rogan podcast either. I saw clips of his on YouTube. I think I watched one full episode until recently. I re-engaged with the podcast to really kind of get a sense of who he is and what he's about before making this. I watched 2 full episodes, but I never was a massive fan. And I didn't know much about who he was, although a lot of people who I respect like him, like Israel Adesanya, the UFC fighter, a few people that I look up to, I admire, they like Joe Rogan. But anyways, lads, we touched on the media coverage in regards to COVID misinformation. Then there was a compilation video put out by India Ari. And even prior to that, I think it's important to state that some artists on Spotify, Neil Young, India Ari, Joni Mitchell, I believe, they claimed that Spotify had to choose between platforming Rogan into the future or platforming their music, and Spotify chose Rogan. So this caused controversy. Following that, India Ari put out a video of Joe Rogan saying the N-word, a compilation video of Joe Rogan saying the N-word successively. And another video was put out to complement that of Joe Rogan saying something like he went to a black neighborhood and he felt as if he was in Planet of the Apes. This is when he went to watch the movie Planet of the Apes. And to complement that, there was another video I saw recently of Joe Rogan speaking to someone who is light-skinned or mixed race and saying to that person, you know, you had one black parent, one white parent. That means you have the best of both worlds. You're born with a white brain and a black bone. Sean laughing. Sean wants to get me in trouble. This is not my reaction when I watched the video, by the way. I was pretty disgusted. You're born with a white brain and a black body. So yeah, these are the comments in total that he made. And this, of course, led to furor and uproar. And I saw a plethora of different reactions. So for me, when I saw the N-word video, I wasn't like, I'm going to get into this now in a moment and I'll share my views more concretely. But when I sato the N-word video, I was disturbed without a doubt because it's a word that should not be used. But then I saw his apology. And I'll be completely frank, Joe Rogan's apologies, both for the COVID misinformation and the N-word video, were some of, if not the most sincere public apologies I have ever seen. I felt as if I could predict how his apology was going to go based upon, you know, the YouTubers who's like messed up in 2012 where they're like white background, like the thumbnail is like a tear coming out of their eye, which is probably just like induced by onions or something. And they're like, I know that communities will be hurt. You know, it's like you can tell what they're going to say in the approach. Rogan's apologies for both videos, I think, were phenomenal. And what really had me appreciate them was the fact that he had every incentive in the world not to issue those apologies. He had every incentive. All his friends on the political right would have admired him. He would have got Fox News coverage, Ben Shapiro types. They would have supported him if he did not release an apology. Yet he did. I think Trump condemned him for releasing an apology and said that he should not have actually done that. And Luke, you and I have spoke about Jordan Peterson, another controversial figure. And a great point Luke has always made to me is the fact that Peterson's message, like in regards to philosophy, self-help, religion, is super diluted by his political stuff, particularly because his political stuff sometimes seems to be spurred by a financial incentive, because there's money now in the game of putting out a particular political message to a particular tribe. Rogan could so easily, I think, fall at the wayside by embracing that, but he didn't. And I don't know many people on the political right in America who would have took the approach he did. So then the N-word video, I was kind of like, context matters to a certain extent, despite the fact that the word should not be used. There's a difference between being a racist, and I know what a racist is as a black person. I actually put out a tweet about this. I said, if you hyper-focus on the genuine mistakes of the good people, you're blind to the schemes of the bad person. And I think here in Ireland, for example, when I think of a racist, I think of the Gemma O'Dohertys. I think of the actual political figures, the ordinary people who are genuinely committed to stoking division and fear in Ireland. And coming from Longford lads, and I'm sure we can all speak to this, I know people that I grew up with growing up when I was younger who said the N-word frequently, who were very racist when I was younger. But I've witnessed these people change. I've seen them change through interacting with me and playing sports with me and learning about me, going to the homework club with me, having me help them with their homework as they help me with mine, eventually going to their house, befriending people in their family. I've seen people change. And I think this is also because of the nature of the environment that we have been in touch with in Longford, the working class environment. You see people change regularly. You see people who have been, convicted criminals come back and reform themselves and come out to be good people. So I can't, in my right mind, look at someone like Joe Rogan and say, he's a threat in regards to racism, when I've seen people say far worse, but also change. So the N-word video was somewhat, I could take it. But then the Planet of the Apes video came, and that was hard to take. And then the kind of comments he met to his light-skinned friend were not great either. So I wonder, what were your reactions when you saw the compilation of racist rhythms Joe Rogan put together or committed to rhetorically? Don't be shy.
I love how Luke let me take that one first. Yeah, see, there's not an awful lot I can say on this. I don't mean in like I feel restricted, but I mean from literally a personal experience point of view. There's a lot I simply can't attest to. I think first, actually, one thing I want to say about, you were saying about Joe being, he could have been embraced by the political right. In fairness to him, he is politically left on pretty much everything. Like, he is somebody who has gone and said he quite liked a lot of what Bernie Sanders said. So he has been kind of painted by a lot of people on the left as this far right figure, when really, with the exception of the vaccine stuff, majority of his opinions are very left-leaning. But in terms of what you said about context, I do think, although that word should never be said, I do think to a certain point, context does matter. If that clip had been, say, a 20-minute long one where you saw the 30 or 40 seconds either side, and you were still able to go, John, that's still bad. That's still really, really bad. I'd be like, okay, fair enough. But what I mean is, if it was the punchline to a joke every time, like the Planet of the Apes one is fucking disgusting. Like, it's not like, it's just offensive. There's no even humor in it. There's nothing about it. There's no saving grace to it at all. It's just disgusting. But the N-word, if the video was him screaming the N-word at somebody 30 times, I'd be like, you know what? Yeah, I don't think he should be cancelled, but I'm not going to listen to him anymore because he is quite obviously a racist. The fact that a lot of those times were him repeating what someone else had said, again, he shouldn't have done it. But for me personally, that changes what I would think of him.
Yeah, no, and I understand that the black guy asking like the white dudes, like, what did you think? And he said that.
There's only so much we can say here.
It's usually the other way around, but I do think it's important as we progress in the convo to get your initial reaction to, because these are the two main things: the COVID misinformation and the racism stuff. So yeah, I would love to get your thoughts before we proceed. So Luke, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, as a white person, as Sean kind of said, and you even said, Eric, like, I don't think it's for me to like ultimately cast judgment of whether, he's right or wrong in this situation. But ultimately, like, I do think it's wrong. Obviously, I think it's wrong. That word should never be said. Like, it's not a word that should be said, and that's been clear for years. That it's just not a word you say publicly, even if you're quoting something. And I think the clip itself, like as Sean said, there's no context to the clip in a lot of the cases, and it's just the split second where it's said. And I think, as far as I know, a lot of those instances in that clip, they're him quoting someone else, which isn't okay. But context is important because it's not him, as Sean said. It's not like he's shouting the word at someone or calling someone the word. So that's important. It shouldn't be said. But him saying it didn't come from a hateful place, I don't think. It was just him quoting something, and maybe he was maybe just popped out, maybe he was ill-informed, but it's not right. The Planet of the Apes comment that's racist. Like, I think he even said himself that was racist, and that's awful. But ultimately, again, these are like moments in time. And I think the way the video was put together, all of these specific moments in time were put together to try and make him look like someone that I don't think he is. Like, I don't think Joe Rogan isn't a racist. Like, I definitely wouldn't call him a racist because he said these things. And a clip you sent me, Eric, was from the Breakfast Club podcast. I think it was Charlemagne, the God, that said it. Just because someone says racist things doesn't mean they're a racist. And obviously they shouldn't. No one should say racist things. That's not an excuse to like, okay, there's a, start saying some, you can say a few racist things and you're not a racist. No one should. It's wrong. But just because you do say something in a moment of time, that doesn't like mean that you as a character are racist. And I think we might get into the clip itself and the motivation behind the clip. Ultimately, there are moments in time that are really bad, and he should apologize, and he has apologized. But I don't think that means he's a racist.
Yeah, well, as the black guy, I think I do to a great extent agree with you. Of course, as he said in his apology, in no circumstance is the use of the word good or tolerable. I think the three factors, and I think I named a few of them earlier. Number one, I think it's just based upon my disposition and the type of person that I try to be. Coming from, again, where I did and seeing what I have in regards to people's capacity to change and amend themselves and become better people, and hearing people say things that were racist, but who haven't been genuinely racist people, as compared to people who are genuinely racist and committed to racism. I cannot brand Rogan as the type of a racist that I need to be concerned with or worried about, because I think there are far more pressing issues and far more pressing people to be concerned with in regards to racism. Because if you call Joe Rogan a genuine racist, you have to think of the bracket you're putting him in, and the people who also belong to that bracket too, and whether his place in that bracket therefore is warranted. You have to consider that's number one. So seeing people reform and change, and people who have said far worse things than Rogan, I guess that's my experience. Secondly, though, is context, cultural context or temporal context. I grew up watching, when I was very young, KSI. And if I took a 2012 KSI video or any YouTuber from that time, and I released it today, talks of cancellation would spring up because of the fact that at that time things were said, skits were created. Like Charlemagne in the video you're talking about, Luke, said that every comedian, every broadcaster has said something. Howard Stern has said incredibly racist things. I believe after the rapper Tupac died, he was making jokes about how the death came because of, kind of fallacious reasons or something like this. So I think everybody can find something or dig up something from a public figure's past and make them look bad, particularly in a temporal context in which those things are tolerable. Now, I, as a black person, think the word is never tolerable. And I think because of the fact that now voices from the black community and voices of color, because now they're kind of included in the public fora of discourse more than previously, that's why there's more of a stronger attitude of resistance against the use of the word. However, I think the temporal context has to be accounted for. So these two factors are the reasons why I wasn't quick to call him an out-and-out racist, because I know there are people genuinely committed to racism, and I know there are people who have said things that are racist and reformed, but also because of the time in which things were said. I think a lot of the clips, though, were from recent videos. I think that needs to be accounted for, too. I know there were clips from his older podcasts, you can see from the video, but there were recent clips, too. So, but it's interesting how people reacted. And I wonder what your thoughts are on this, especially you, Sean. I know you're not the professional conspiracy theorist, but you bring out the good ones in our conversations. A lot of black people, I went on the app Clubhouse, and there was a black guy who came on a conversation, and they were talking about Joe Rogan. He was from the UK, and it was an American-based conversation. And the black guy came on and he said, look, I get it. I don't like Joe Rogan. I'm not a fan of his stuff. But are you going to really have me think that all of a sudden people don't like him, the mainstream people don't like him? This is how he put it, I'm paraphrasing. And now they put out a video of him saying the N-word. They just want to get me and my people angry at him to help them make them their own political point. They're just trying to drag us black people in here. He said, you have to use your mind. He's like, this is how white supremacy works. You know, they manipulate us into fighting their battles. This is the kind of way he taught. And of course, talked. And of course, I don't agree with that completely. Of course, there's gaps in the thinking. However, as always, there's somewhat of a kernel of, maybe not truth, but an aspect of that resonated with me. Same with a guy I know who's a Rogan fan. He told me that it seems so staged and coordinated. And I don't agree with this. I think this is conspiratorial, out and out. But I wanted to test that theory with you to see what you think. Whether the fact that it's like there's a political motive amongst some to demonize Rogan, without a shadow of a doubt, in my opinion. Like, I don't know if you saw what happened with CNN and Rogan, Sanjay Gupta. He's a guy who worked for CNN. Rogan had him on his podcast. Because Rogan took ivermectin, as you alluded to, Luke, on CNN, they claimed that he took horse dewormer. So Rogan had someone from CNN on his podcast and said, why did you guys lie about me on your channel? So it seems as if there are particular figures, people who just dislike Rogan, whether that's for political reasons or, as some conspiracies have it, because they're jealous of the fact that he's trumping the mainstream media. So what do you think of this guy's theory, the guy that came on the Clubhouse chat? Do you think it's completely hubbubaloo, fallacious, or do you think there's a kernel of truth to it? Yeah, Sean, you can come in.
Oh, yes. I definitely think there's some truth in it. I don't think it is. So again, I don't think it's some grand plan. I mentioned it earlier. He is worth to Spotify the same as a Taylor Swift album every day. Financially, views-wise, everything, he is massive. Whether you like him or not, whether you think he's good or not, he's huge. People gravitate towards him in a way that people are not gravitating towards platforms like CNN. I absolutely think that there's been an attempt to take him down, and I don't know if somebody within CNN made that clip. I can't speak to that. I have absolutely zero proof one way or the other. I can't say anything on that. But you already mentioned there the ivermectin. They have tried for the last 6 months to take him down a peg or two, because they know that he is a shining light of what new media is going to look like. It is going to be somebody with a microphone and a laptop and half the budget that they require to make one of their shows. And that's their business model, like I said already, is failing, it is dying, and he represents that. He represents the opposite to that, or I can't even think of the word, the change. I don't know if it was made, if that clip was made by somebody, but the timing of it seems very, very well coordinated, is what I'd say.
Yeah, conspiracy. Sean's a good man for the conspiracy. I remember sitting in maths and history with Sean.
Don't shame me, don't know.
Doing some math, doing some history. And Sean started talking about like JFK and like, Sean, just stop, Sean. But no, anyway, Sean loves conspiracies, and I used to get annoyed with Sean for conspiracies, but yeah, that's a story for another day. But in this situation, like, if you're to look at it through the lens of like mainstream media versus new media, like, I think it's definitely not like some wild conspiracy to think that maybe there was a concerted effort by people in mainstream media to try and discredit Joe Rogan. I mean, businesses discredit each other all the time. So I think it's definitely possible. But if I was to like come up with an answer to the question of like, why did this video come out? I think I tried to think of my own reaction to when all this initially came out. And that was like, okay, Joe Rogan's cancelled, like, he's gone. That was just like an assumption that came into my brain as soon as I saw the story. And I think it's part of our culture now. And I really, like, even to say the word cancel culture, I feel like I'm Ben Shapiro. I'm definitely not. But I think it's ingrained in our society now that, you know, if someone is kind of brought into disrepute, there's like a process of cancellation. And one of those processes is to go back through everything they've said publicly, and collect the information and put it out there. And we see that, like, even in the smallest cases in Ireland, where if someone comes into disrepute, someone searches their Twitter, and literally what people do is search like all of the like offensive terms they can think of, use someone's @ and put that in until they find things that people said, you know. And so I think that's what happened here, that people said, Joe Rogan, someone who I completely disagree with politically. I think Joe Rogan, someone said that, he needs to be deplatformed. And it could take one person to do that. It might take some time. But to go through old videos and find instances of him saying things that, and obviously they did that and they were awful instances. But I think what's more probable is that someone who wanted to see Joe Rogan cancelled did this. I don't think it's someone in CNN HQ who did it. Not far, like it's not impossible, but I do think it's more so this cancel culture that we've seen.
Yeah, Sean, I know you want to come in. I want to really quickly share.
Yeah, go on.
I think I shared this with you, Luke. I think I did. I think they found the people who put together the N-word video. It's a group of guys who own a podcast, and somebody interviewed them. Somebody was interviewing them. I think it was the Breaking Point. So that's Crystal Ball. No, sorry. Somebody, as I got to this interview of the guys who put together the N-word video through the Breaking Point. It's like a media outlet. It's a new media outlet. They cover current affairs and politics in the USA. So they covered a video in which somebody interviewed those who put together the N-word montage from Joe Rogan. And one of the people who was part of the group, the collective that put together that montage, actually once said the N-word. He's a white American in the past himself. He once said the N-word in the past himself. And he was confronted about this and he denied it in the video. And I think there was like an agreement at the end between him, his group, and the person interviewing the group of the people who put together the montage, not to release the video of him saying the N-word, because I think the person had exclusive access to it or something like this, because he didn't want to be outed. So I think this in itself speaks to the contradiction of it all. And I think, Luke, I don't like saying the word cancel culture too. Like I have a video on my YouTube channel and a podcast episode on it, and one on the term woke. But I think what I was speaking to then is radically different to how the terms have been misappropriated today, particularly by the political right, who are unconsciously participating in the culture that they're condemning, which is quite ironic and hilarious. But nonetheless, I think this speaks to the contradiction of the nature of cancel culture, how it clashes with the nature of being. Like everybody has skeletons in their wardrobe, and if you're going to start pointing at someone else's, you better be sure that there's none in yours. And that's nearly impossible because there has to be some in yours for growth to occur as a human being. So I think this really interestingly points to the contradiction of any culture which aims at canceling a human being. Like the human being is not static. They're not stuck in time. And I know I referenced what I've seen in regards to racist statements. And Sean, I'm going to let you come in, but I would love to hear your comments on what I said, like about growing up around people or not even growing up, meeting people who might have particular problematic views on a particular issue because of their socioeconomic, cultural, religious environment, and then seeing them change over time. Like in my context, it was growing up as I did in Longford, the fact that I came from an African household, super traditionalist views, and a Christian environment. And I think the equivalent here in Ireland is the Catholic environment. Like when I talked to some people about Rogan, they told me they didn't like him. He was the embodiment of racism and toxic masculinity. They talked about episodes from his podcast. And I was like, fair enough. He said things that were reprehensible. I'm not a fan of his per se, but for me to believe that he's out and out committed to these words that you're using, I need to see concrete evidence. And I just don't see that. Furthermore, how many people do you know have an Irish granny or auntie who super Catholic, like she voted no, unfortunately, like like debating at the dinner table saying, oh, like, John, I know what you mean, but it's 2022. Like, come on. Like, I think everyone can appeal to this reality because it's the nature of being. But I think it takes a level of sophistication to have a family member and say, they have these views on this issue, but I don't hate them because I know there's far more to them than that. But within discourse today, I think there's somewhat of an incentive to not be sophisticated in your thinking and to think in dichotomous ways. And people put people in one box on the other. And if they're in the box of your enemy, all hell can reign because you can say what you like about them, do what you want to them. And the worse the label you ascribe to the other box, by gosh, the worse the things you're allowed to say. You have a license to say as you want. And I know this is not a scientifically valid term to some, but I think it's spiritually destructive, to use a word that I use frequently for convenience, it's spiritually destructive to do this because although it's politically savvy and you could score points, get thousands of likes on Twitter, I think something erodes internally in regards to your ability to empathize and engage with other human beings and understand being when you act in this manner. Sorry, Sean, I spoke for far longer than I intended to.
No worries, Todd. I can't even remember what it was that I was going to say. I think the fellow you were thinking of who made that video, Dave Portnoy, I think, was was where that clip was from. But yeah, the cancel culture, it's strange because I know what it started off as, and I know that it was started with very good intentions. Like, if I'm not mistaken, it was kind of the Me Too was the first instance of somebody getting cancelled, but that was for people that had done horrendous things and who deserved to no longer be in positions of power, if I'm not mistaken. But there's a Jonathan Haidt, I think he wrote The Coddling of the American Mind. He was talking to Joe Rogan about it a couple of years ago, and he made a very good point about it. He said that the right completely overblow how bad cancel culture is, but the left think it doesn't happen at all. And it's somewhere in the middle. It's not this pervasive thing where, like, and I know, Luke, you even said, and we were even joking beforehand, we were saying, oh, this is going to be the episode that we get cancelled for. But realistically, it's not. Like, it's not going to be a case that we're going to say something, unless one of us decides to break out into some, terrible rant on something that maybe then we might get kicked off. But even, like, I think it has been blown out of proportion. I think it's something that, like, and even there's an example of it now happening in Ireland at the moment with the two Johnnies, but like, it's a storm that seems to come. Like, the Joe Rogan thing really, as far as I'm concerned, has died down. Like, it was very big there about a fortnight ago, if even, and then it just kind of seemed to everyone to say, all right, what's next? And it's the same with the two Johnnies. Like, I would imagine that if they, unless RTE decide to get rid of them, I would say that if they just wait a week and come back next Monday, I'd say that the world will have moved on. People will have forgotten. Like, it does seem to just be the way we interact with media. It's all very instant, very fast, and like the news cycle is so quick that you're going to be out of it straight away. So, like, I think it is something we need to watch and kind of keep an eye on and not let it get completely out of control. Like, I think the two Johnnies thing is ridiculous. I think that is, like, whatever about the Joe Rogan thing. Sorry, yeah, I'll explain very briefly. They have a running segment of their podcast where and it's been going since day one, where they get messages sent in from their listeners. And I've listened to the Johnnies since day dot. I know they're not everyone's cup of tea. They're not offensive, I would say, in any way, shape, or form. For the most part, they aren't. But their humor is very kind of your man at the pub, playing county. It's very kind of, down the country.
Laddish.
Yeah, not even laddish, I would say. Just very kind of, it has a very stereotypical rural Ireland. Everyone plays county, everyone eats chicken rolls, and that's just it. But they have a segment where each week some people send in things from outside, and they usually have running kind of topics for a couple of weeks, and then they'll die down and something new will come up. And for the last month or so, they've had one where people send in scandalous pictures of scandalous bumper stickers on cars. And the entire thing is, it's not them reading it out and going, oh, Jesus, listen to this. Isn't that such a cool thing to have in a car? It's them going, who in fuck's name? And the 30-second clip where I don't even want to say it now because I feel I'll get taken out of fucking context now or something. But the line was, a woman had on her car, she's not a princess, she's a slut, was basically what was said. And the 30-second clip that they had up in their TikTok had one of the two Johnnies literally going, no, that's too far. That's fucking scandalous. Like, they're not reading it going, geez, I'd love to have this in my car. I might see if I can find where they sell this. It's literally them taking the piss out of the people that have it. And I think maybe it's because they've recently joined with RTE and they're now public broadcasters. That seems to be why there's so much furore. But that podcast was their own private podcast and was recorded before they'd started with RTE. So But I'd imagine if they don't lose their job, but they may do it RTE within 2 weeks' time, nobody will be thinking about it. So that's kind of what I'm saying about cancel culture.
Yeah, Luke, you want to go in?
Yeah, just to agree with Sean on a few things, like I do think that
Makes a nice change.
I do think it's probably overblown. It's certainly cancel culture is certainly overblown by the right. Definitely, like it's not this absolutely pervasive problem where people are being cancelled and like sent to some sort of gulag day by day. But I do think it's a really serious problem, and it's a serious problem when it comes to discourse, like how we communicate as people. But also, like, and Eric, you put it well when you talk about like kind of being spiritual and being human. I think it's a problem for humanity as well. We kind of reduce ourselves to morally good or morally bad because of things we said in specific moments of time. And I think a lot of it does exist in like the echo chamber of online, particularly Twitter, and now kind of TikTok. You kind of see a lot of this discourse on now too. But it does hold really, really important weight though, because people have lost their jobs. People have been kind of ostracized, logged out of social media and not appeared for years, because of something they said in a moment of time 4 or 5 years ago. And suddenly it's brought to spotlight, normally because something prominent happens. You get a new job, you're elected to a position, you get a new show on RT, like the two Johnnies, and people use this, highlight it, and then their sole aim is to promote it so much that pressure builds and you're gone, like, and you are sent to this gulag of like being cancelled. And like this kind of judgment being placed on you as being a morally flawed person, so morally flawed that you don't deserve a platform. And the whole conversation about platforming is there as well. I think you see that in the discourse about the two Johnnies, where people are saying that, why are you giving them, these misogynists, a platform because of those specific moments in time? When you place that moral judgment on people, I think there's something seriously wrong with how we view each other as people. It's not human. Like you wouldn't, if we were sitting around a table and Eric said something wrong, I can't even imagine me saying, Eric, do you know what? You can't talk anymore. You can't appear in public because I don't agree with you. And that what you said then was sexist. And so you're a sexist person. That's not how human beings interact with each other. They never have. And so I am genuinely concerned about this trend because like it is a new trend. Like I do think it's only going to become more, like we see it on TikTok. Like I feel old to be on TikTok, right? But we see that coming through on TikTok, and I do worry that it's going to become a part of our culture, cancel culture, to use the term.
Yeah, no, those are really great, stirring statements, lads. I think you put it really well, and I really appreciate the nuance too in your contributions. Both of you acknowledge that cancel culture can sometimes be overblown and used as a political weapon when it's overblown. I might add, like with the Rogan controversy, what I saw from some on the right in America, but a lot of people too, and I think the fanatic kind of zealous Rogan fans, what they did, they were very quick with the N-word video, for example, to say it's context, get over it, you're too emotional about what he did. And the ironic thing is that actually clashed with Rogan's apology. In Rogan's apology, he acknowledged that this is a word that is one of the most unique words in the English language. It's a word that can't be used. So Rogan's apology was actually imbued with a level of modesty that wasn't seen by a lot of people that defended him and kind of used the cancel culture banner as one to exonerate Rogan for his quote-unquote cultural crimes. But then on the flip side, to what we're saying about the way discourse is like weirdly shaped today, we referenced the January 6th article on CNN. For those who don't know, there was an article written for CNN in which Rogan's bloopers were equated to the January 6th moment. I think I talked about this earlier, when there was an insurrection on the Capitol. A group of people stormed the Capitol in the United States of America. And in it, points were made about how Rogan's use of the N-word represents he's essentially making the N-word publicly acceptable, the use of the word. And that can be equated to what January 6th was, in that it opened the door for political mayhem and a disrespect, and open and flagrant disrespect for constitutional rights like democracy and the like. So you saw hyperbole on that side too, where Rogan was made out to be a demon. And I do want to draw once more on what I said about your personal experience, lads. Like, do you feel like I feel like I can't I feel like I just can't support cancel culture. Like I don't even use the term. I just can't support the idea authentically. I can't. If I did that, I'd feel like I'd be betraying myself. Just because it's almost like when you see how someone can change in your life, or when you see someone in your life who has a particular perspective because they grew up in Catholic Ireland, and you know they're far more than those views, you just can't go out and tweet and say, I don't know, maybe it's a dispositional thing, because I think a lot of people who claim a monopoly on the whole anti-cancel culture movement, they maybe overlook the fact that some people just have characteristics and traits that see them being more forgiving. I think that's a factor that we can't overlook too. A lot of people were in different stages in our life, in our growth, in our development. We were raised to think in different ways. We have a particular disposition. Some people are more forgiving and kind than others. Even if cancel culture didn't exist, it wasn't in the lexicon today, there'd be people who are just so not tolerant and so not open to forgiving that they'd be angry. Maybe it'd be replaced by something else that's a norm that's already existed within our civilization. But I feel, based on people I've interacted with, how I've witnessed people change, how I feel I've changed, I can't strip that right from anybody else. And I'm actually studying restorative justice here in Belgium for Erasmus. And a lot of the principles that are enshrined in the kind of philosophy of restorative justice, I think are being desecrated and urinated on rhetorically, quite frankly, by a lot of what I see on Twitter. So do you think there's an authentic aspect to this? Do you think you can't render Joe Rogan an irredeemably evil person because of your own experience, authentic experience as human beings? Anyone can chime in.
See, yeah, morally, I agree with you. I can't stand behind what cancel culture is. I just can't. Luke made a brilliant point there. If we were all sitting around a table and someone says something bad, you wouldn't react in that way. And it is down to, like what I said before, how media has become so quick and so pervasive, and we have information at the touch of a fingertip, and it is so easy to get, like, these social media platforms are, if you haven't watched it, is it the Social Media? Is a documentary on Netflix. Is very good. It explains how social media sites are set up to activate dopamine responses in your brain so that you keep going, and that things that trigger a negative reaction in you, that make you angry, that make you upset, keeps you on that app for longer. So they have reason to show you the worst stuff that they know is going to get a response out of you. But yeah, from a moral point, like I can't render Joe Rogan a racist because I have watched him and I've listened to him for a long time. I know he has said some pretty shitty stuff, but there's nothing in that I personally be able to go, that's not somebody I listen to anymore. I stopped. Eric will attest to this. I used to have quite controversial, quite right-leaning opinions on a lot of things, and I was quite a fan of a certain Ben Shapiro. But as I grew and as I had conversations with people like you, Eric, I've mentioned this before on podcasts, we had conversations that really changed my perspective, because it was the first time I was looking outside of that echo chamber, and the first time that I was seeing a different point of view. And now when if I see Ben Shapiro on something, I turn him off, because I think he's a fucking racist. Like the stuff, and I personally, I think the stuff that, like, Joe Rogan even had him on, was it last summer after the Black Lives Matter protests? And Joe Rogan dismantled his argument completely, like bit by bit. I think he was going about how black people in America need to just, not join a gang and not pick up a gun. And John's like, yeah, but like they grew up in such an environment that sometimes it's the only place that they get, they have a male role model or something like that. You become what you see. If you grow up in those circumstances, you're going to act in a certain way. There's nothing, anybody could do that. And Ben Shapiro grew up, I would reckon, in quite a privileged background. And as a result, he is who he is. And that's fine. But like the difference I would say between Joe Rogan and Ben Shapiro is that I know for a fact that Joe Rogan is at the heart of it as a good person, and as somebody who, if he is proven wrong, will change his opinion. If you are able to beat his argument, he isn't just going to go, well, I don't like you. So that's it. He will change his argument. I've seen it happen. I've seen him be made a complete and utter fool. And when he does it, in fairness to him, unlike a lot of people, he will then go and post about that on social media. He will then take that minute or that 2-minute clip and he will tweet it and he'll put it on Instagram or he'll put it on TikTok and go, I was made to look like an idiot. And he'll move on from that and he'll change his opinions and he'll change the way he acts based on how his opinion has been changed in that instance. So like I don't think that he's a bad person. I think there's two issues with it for me. I think the race one is one thing, and we've already talked in depth about that. But like I said earlier about the anti-vax stuff, we have to be able to question these things. I think I am pro-vaccine completely. I am triple jabbed. I think it is the reason that Ireland is in such a good place with COVID now, that a majority of people have got their vaccines. But we have to be able to question this stuff. You have to be able to go, hang on, why is that? You have to be able to ask these questions. And if this idea of trust the science is supposed to be poked and prodded, and you're supposed to have a go at it, and it's supposed to be able to resist all your arguments. And if it doesn't, it probably isn't a very good theory, or it probably isn't a very good answer. That's just my little rant over.
That's the one that gets you cancelled, Sean. All right. Luke, do you want to come in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think your question, Eric, like, it doesn't worry sit with me to say that anyone is like so bad or has done so many bad things that they're like an unredeemable person or they're evil. It's a really unnatural and unhuman thing to do, to like cast that judgment on someone. Like there's goodness and badness, there's evil, whatever you believe spiritually, you know, there's evil and, you know, divinity within everyone, and goodness within everyone. So I don't think anyone's so bad that they should be like cast away or sent into the desert and never come back. You know, like no one's that bad. And you know, cancel culture. There, of course, we need to differentiate people who cast judgment on people because of their discourse and because of people who commit crimes. Like ultimately, someone who commits a crime is a bad person, and they go to jail for that, and there's systems in place to deal with that. But like specifically about discourse, I really think it's the most unnatural thing. I actually think it's kind of evil in itself to cast judgment on someone because of stuff they said in the past, and sort of, you know, cancel them or send them into oblivion or deplatform them or kind of make them feel like they're second-class citizens because they said something bad in the past. It's so unnatural. There's no compassion in it. And I don't think there's any empathy, is a word you used earlier, Eric. I think there's a complete lack of empathy in the whole concept of saying that someone's so bad because they said something. And that because they said something that is racist or is sexist, that they are a sexist person or they are a racist person. It's just so, there's no logic in it. And it's cruel, I think. I do think we need to be more empathetic and generally. Like, and one of the things, like, Pope John Paul, when Pope John Paul was shot, like someone tried to kill the man. Pope John Paul went and met him in prison and forgave him. The man was sentenced to life in prison, and a few years later, Pope John Paul requested for him to be pardoned and sent home. And like, that's empathy and that's forgiveness. And yes, it comes from a spiritual place. But like, what's the point in living if it's this battle between, you know, people based on what they say? I just don't think it's not a good way to live, and it's not a world that I want to live in, where because of something that I said 5 years ago, in 5 years' time, someone could say, "You're banished, Luke." That's just not good. And with Joe Rogan, specifically, to answer your question, sorry, Eric, absolutely no, I don't think he's unredeemable. The stuff he said is really silly. COVID misinformation is bad. I don't think it's good. Sean, to your fact, questioning science, like, of course, everything's questionable, especially authority and mandates and stuff like that. I'd rather see two scientists on both sides of the argument have that conversation in a facilitated way. I'm not sure Joe Rogan, who's like I think he calls himself an idiot. I don't think it's best for him to maybe facilitate that discussion. I'd rather see both sides. I think that's something that he's acknowledged himself, that he wants to see more so. Like, it's okay to listen to mainstream opinion as well as contrarian opinion. So ultimately, I'm I'm not sure how coherent the whole argument has been, but ultimately, no, he's not a bad person. I don't think anyone's inherently evil, except for maybe like Hitler or some genocidal dictator. Like, I don't think anyone's inherently evil.
Yeah, perfect. And Sean, I know you want to come in. This time I am going to briefly say that I know Luke, I like when I first got involved with the ISSU, like for the first 3 years, I think I just randomly thank Luke for different things. If something good happened, let's say in my relationship with my role with the ISSU or something, I'd always be like, thanks so much, Luke. You've been such a good friend. I wouldn't be doing what I am because of you. And that speaks to your point, Sean, about how your perspectives and political views have changed because of interaction with friends. I think once you're subject to that, or a facilitator for that, you can't then backtrack and say that I'm going to think that this person, whoever, is irredeemable and isn't worthy of forgiveness. And Luke, that example of Pope John Paul is a brilliant example. Like there's another example of Martin Luther King Jr. He was stabbed. He nearly died. The doctor said that if he sneezed as a result of the stab wound, he would have died. But then he forgave the person who did it. I really think we are disincentivized from thinking in this way because of how tribalistic we are as Homo sapiens. But Twitter like fuels that. It incentivizes that. You get 1,000 likes for being that way. You can build a whole political platform and make money from content on YouTube from thinking in that way. That's why the Shapiros are as polarizing as they are, and equivalents on the left who are equally dogmatic with their political rhetoric. Rogan exists in a gray zone right between that, and that's why he is so revered. That he's cracked a code that not only the mainstream media hasn't cracked, but Shapiro hasn't cracked that code. Name the equivalent of the left. They haven't cracked the Rogan code, because even the conversations I listened to prep for this, so authentic. It's like I feel like I'm at a living room with someone from your neighborhood or state. These are the type of conversations that are being had, and I'm not even condemning it or praising it, lauding it. But I think there's something unique and authentic about that that speaks to a deeper genuinity and sincerity that I can't undermine unless I see sufficient evidence that points in another direction. And I simply haven't. And something that I think that has happened to my last point, Sean, is that I've seen a lot of people make points about the people who support Rogan. Like I've seen a lot of rhetoric in America, articles written, videos from American YouTubers, but also some people in Ireland who've said, well, the people who flock towards Rogan tend to be the kind of white, racist, Trump-supporting, the people who are bastions of toxic masculinity. And maybe that might be true for a subset, because I've seen things that Rogan has said, I've heard things that Rogan has said, which have been deplorable. I think he made a comment, or he facilitated a space for his friend to make a comment about backstage and comedy shows, how he had girls do particular things to him. And I can barely listen to that stuff. It's disgusting. Same with the racist stuff. However, for me, like, again, I said this earlier, lads, everyone I know who's an anti-vaxxer is an anti-vaxxer for some of the deeper reasons that I identified earlier. Everyone I know who's a Rogan fan isn't an anti-vaxxer or is a lovely person. It just doesn't connect with the widespread caricature that this man and everyone who supports him fit within a particular box. So it's less to do with Rogan, and I think more to do with the nature of discourse and how we talk about one another and our relationships, how we relate to one another, that really is quite bothersome about this whole matter. And I think we have to try and stomp out culturally. But Sean, you had a comment. That wasn't brief. I'm sorry for
that. That's all right. I just kind of want to agree with Luke on a few things. I think it should be a debate between two scientists. I would love if at some point he had your man, the two fellas he had on before, McCullough, and I don't know what the other fella's name is, on to debate a mainstream scientist. I'm not saying don't listen to the mainstream at all. I'm saying that mainstream science should just be questioned. You shouldn't take it at absolute blind faith. If there's something, like I said earlier, a year ago, things that were considered absolute fact, absolute science, have in the past year we've figured out, actually, no, they're not. And you should be able to ask these questions. If you don't get the answers. Like, the lab leak one is quite an interesting one, because he had somebody on, Jamie Metzel, I think his name was, who worked with the Clinton administration, who was saying back in August, literally, I think 2 weeks before, the World Health Organization sent a team out to China to basically try and discover the origins of the virus. He said, I can predict exactly now what will happen. They'll come back and say there's no evidence that it came from a lab. Within a month, the World Health Organization will go, we weren't allowed to see everything. most of the stuff, we got seemed to be destroyed. We weren't shown all the right places. And that's exactly word for word what happened. You can go and look at that podcast now. He predicts it about a month or so in advance. And if he had said that on Twitter at that time, he would have probably been cancelled for it. Or he probably would have got into trouble for it, because that was seen as an absolute. That was seen as something that couldn't be argued with. So, I think I'm not saying absolutely just trust the mainstream with everything, but we should be able to question it. And if questioning certain things leads to being cancelled, then I dread the road that we're going down. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I was going to say stuff about point of view, but I think, Eric, you kind of covered it there in what you were saying.
Okay, I think it's very important for us now, lads, I'd like to ask you about accountability, because this is not an episode where I intended to sympathize with Rogan and make the case that he's a good person and his podcast is great. The only reason why I listened to his podcast as of late is because, one, he had someone who I really admire on, but I was on Spotify looking at his podcast to prepare for this episode. And as stated, the things he said about COVID-19 that are untrue and anti-truth, to be quite frank, are wrong. The racist things he said are deplorable. But the apologies to me seem sincere. And the reaction to me against Rogan, a lot of it seems hyperbolic, to say the least. But accountability, like what happens next? Because the conversation we just had for the past 15 minutes, we talked about forgiveness and empathy, and it was an anti-cancel culture conversation. When I see these conversations, people end there usually. They don't go on to talk about the need to confront the likes of Rogan and ensure that he makes an effort to learn from his mistakes. Because, I think there's justice and there's mercy. I don't know, Luke, I know you cover theology in your degree. There's a part of the Bible. Sorry for putting you on the spot, but I believe there's a part of the monotheistic tradition that covers justice and mercy or something. Justice is more stern and it's more strict, and whereas mercy is forbearance, it's empathy. And usually with people like Rogan, who are revered and also hated, with the people who blindly revere him and are unwilling to call out his flaws, they usually focus on mercy. But people who absolutely detest him, they focus on justice. They do it so excessively, both sides, that it distorts mercy and it distorts justice. I think both are symbiotic. So what do you say in regards to accountability? If we're going to accept that people are not to be cancelled and rendered irredeemably evil, what do we do about ensuring that the culture, because people want to speak. We speak, free speech is enabled, and we should be allowed to address how we feel. How do you confront what Rogan has done and approach him? What do you encourage him to do? What do you tell him? How do you hold him to account appropriately if cancel culture is off the table?
Yeah, I might come in if you don't mind. I think accountability is the same way as, like, if after this call, the three of us were on this Zoom link and Sean, you said something that I don't think is right. Like, I wouldn't get really angry at you and say that you're a bad person and, X, Y, and Z. I'd have a conversation with you and try and say that, maybe say, look, I don't think that's right. I think maybe look at this, or, maybe you could rephrase it in a way that isn't as bad. And likewise, I think, like, it's perfectly okay to call Joe Rogan out. But I think there's, like, an escalation and there's no middle ground between, like, holding someone accountable and putting so much pressure on someone that it questions their platform. And so, of course, you can criticize someone, but the escalation doesn't have to be to try and deplatform. And we saw that with Neil Young and Joni Mitchell. And again, I don't want to say that they're bad people, but would it not have been more beneficial maybe for Neil Young and Joni Mitchell to try and enter dialogue with Joe Rogan himself and say, look, we share this platform with Spotify. Let's talk about misinformation and cover misinformation and how we use our platforms as famous people to influence people. They didn't really go down that path of dialogue. They just went down the path of, okay, Spotify, it's either us or him. They didn't enter dialogue. And that's not beyond possibility. That Joe Rogan said he's a fan of Neil Young and Joni Mitchell. So it's not beyond possibility that they could meet up and have a conversation about it and, talk about paths forward. But no, it just entered that kind of escalation phase. And so I think just like you would in any sort of human dynamic, is have a conversation about it and try and have dialogue rather than escalate, I think.
Yeah, thanks. Sean, do you have any comments?
Yeah, no, I would agree with Luke. I don't know, like, who is he accountable to? Is he accountable to Spotify? Is he accountable to his listeners? Like, I don't know. Is like he is just a content creator. Who does he? Is he accountable to the government? Like, what exactly when we say he needs to be held accountable? He has apologized and he says he's going to change, particularly in the COVID misinformation. He said he's going to now, like he actually even did, he had someone on there. He had 2 podcasts. He released them on the same day at the same time. We had somebody who was a climate denier and somebody who was a climate not denier. So I'm going to say climate scientist because, come on, in fairness now. So, like, is that not growth? Is that not change? Is that enough? Like, I don't know. Like, the thing with kind of accountability is I feel like, could he have been cancelled realistically? Like, if he was kicked off Spotify, do we actually think he was just going to go away? Do we honestly think that the 11 million people that listened to each episode were just going to stop? What would most likely have happened would he would have left Spotify. He'd have gone to Rumble or to one of these platforms. He'd have set up there, and anybody who is in his kind of sphere of influence, Tim Dillon, Jimmy Dore, Bill Burr, comedians like that, Jordan Peterson, would most likely have moved with him to whatever platform he'd gone to. So, like, what would have? When I saw this, I was kind of, at parts I was almost laughing because it's like, what do we actually expect is going to happen here? Do we genuinely think that we can just silence somebody who is bigger than most US media platforms? But I don't know. I think if somebody apologizes, I feel, and they say they're going to do better, and you said yourself, Eric, you felt his apology was very sincere, but I just don't know who he is accountable to. Like, is he simply accountable to Spotify because he is on their platform? But he isn't. Then he's also not an employee of Spotify. So, to be honest, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a really good. Those are a really good question. I had on my podcast on cancel culture, the person who I had on actually put that question to me, and I didn't know how to answer it. Both those are great points, Sean. Very good points. The accountability point. When you consider the different perspectives, politically, socially, culturally, that adds more load to the question, who am I accountable to? Because that means everyone's expectation of me is a tad bit different. And I think with cancel culture, I know a lot of people who say, well, it's not like it was ever going to be canceled, so why are people complaining about cancel culture? I think the cultural aspects of the moment, I think whether you link it to cancel culture or just intolerance, I think it doesn't evade the responsibility for us to engage with why people behave and how they do, and tribalism and the negative consequences of that. But yes, this is mostly what I wanted to cover in the podcast. I'm really happy with how it's been, how it's gone. I wonder if there's any final comments any of you have, or if you want to plug anything. I know you already plugged the podcast, but in terms of discourse, in terms of Rogan, anything at all you have to say in regards to how we proceed from this, especially in an Irish context. I think political discourse is, of course, advanced in Ireland, but in a traditional setting, in a traditional political setting. So culturally speaking, what do you think we should take from the Rogan controversy? And I know a lot of people would say, well, we need to learn how we stomp out the likes of Rogan. So people might say we need to learn how we defend free speech, depending on your political orientation. What would you say we need to take from the Rogan controversy, all in all?
Yeah, well, I started the conversation saying that when I first saw this story, that like the first thing that entered my head was that Joe Rogan needs to be cancelled. And that was, I think, me being conditioned to like how this happens, because we've seen it happen so much with people. And to me, that kind of made me think about how I react to these stories and how I deal with issues. And let's just look at Irish politics, for example. One of the things that I've been very annoyed about recently is Sinn Féin, and Sinn Féin and how they treat IRA violence and how they justify the atrocities of the IRA during the Troubles. I am now actively trying to, as much as possible, have that conversation with myself and on Twitter mainly, in a way that's constructive. Like, I don't want to say that Mary Lou is a bad person or that Sinn Féin TDs are bad people because they justify it. I try to ask the question, like, why are you still doing this? Why do you think it's acceptable? Rather than cast that judgment. And that's one example of like changing how we approach when we disagree with something or when we get angry about something, changing the approach to like a genuine discourse and a genuine like curiosity and trying to understand the other side. rather than trying to cast a moral judgment on that. Because I'm probably guilty of that in the past, of saying that Sinn Féin TDs, etc., are bad people because they believe X or they justify X. So yeah, trying to enter discourse and understanding, I suppose, is a way we can move forward, I think.
Yeah, I agree with Luke and part of what he said. I think what we need to do is change how we view media and how we consume media. One of the things that annoyed me, I know I mentioned it earlier, but the two Johnnies thing was I could tell by the comments, particularly comments from TDs, that either A, they had never listened to the two Johnnies before in their lives, like to the actual podcast. They either just saw the 30-second clip or they didn't even see that and just read the quotes. And to be honest, sadly, I think the majority actually fell into C, because you could tell by the way that they were phrasing it that they had just seen the article on it. And that was it. And their opinion was based on that. I think if we take anything, engage your brain when you see something that really, really offends you, that triggers you, and stop for a second before you get onto Twitter and tell the world about how terrible a person Luke is for this little quote that you saw, from the podcast. Actually go and look, what did he say before that? What did he say in that episode? What has he done in the past? Who has he had on his podcast? Who has he talked to? Like, what's his background? Like, have a look at it. Don't just jump to these, split-second decisions. Like Luke said it earlier, if somebody were sitting around a table and someone says something offensive, that person. So if they said something offensive, oh, well, look, either they didn't mean that, or if they did mean it, I know where they're coming from, and I know, maybe we have to talk about this, say this to them. Think a little bit more, I think. I just feel like with things at social media, it's so easy to get offended instantly and then get tweeting. And there's even a word for it, doom scrolling. That kind of negative impact, it triggers these things in your brain that you just want to keep doing it. You want to keep doing it. So I think we need to seriously change how we consume media big time. And that would be the thing I take away the most from this little controversy.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Sean. And Luke, I think that's really good advice to leave people with as we close the podcast. I have to say that I'm optimistic chatting with both of you. Of course, we're all young people, and with time comes knowledge and wisdom. So I think chatting to both of you definitely gives me hope in regards to how here in Ireland we can replicate a lot of the ills that we can see in political and cultural discourse abroad. And hopefully we don't go down that path. I do have to say I'm somewhat pessimistic, though, in regards to, I try not to be utopian in regards to expectation, because I think this is far deeper than a political and cultural question. I think it's a question in regards to human nature and how the environment we're in right now can incentivize the worst of our impulses. But hey, that's a conversation for another day. Thank you both so much for joining me in this conversation. Your contributions were immense. I hope none of us get cancelled from this. If we do, though, if they said anything, it's on me. I'll take it. But yeah, I'll be back with another episode very, very soon. This was a special with two very good friends of mine, and I hope you enjoyed it. Links to, if you're watching this on YouTube, Political Incorrectors and the Dead Icons podcast will be in the description. I advise you to check it out, and bye.